One of the benefits of using namespaces is that you can nest them pretty much as deeply as you want. For example, the system.data.sql client, that namespace contains classes you would use to retrieve data from a SQL Server database, while system.data.oracle client, that namespace contains classes you would use to retrieve data from an Oracle database. And there's a bunch of others. Each namespace in the .NET Framework represents an assembly, or executable code. The assembly files for the .NET Framework class libraries typically consist of the namespace name and a DLL extension. For example, the classes in the system namespace are mostly in the system.dll file, while the classes in the system.io namespace are in the file system.io.dll. So that makes it pretty easy to find what classes in what namespaces are located in what DLL files. When you first create a project of pretty much any kind within Visual Studio, Visual Studio by default sets the namespace and assembly name to the name of the project. So I can go into the project properties pages. I can right-click here, select Properties, and here you can see the assembly name. Now, when I first created this project, I called it OOP Techniques. And so, as part of creating the project, Visual Studio set the assembly name to OOP Techniques as well as the default namespace. Now, notice that I can change either one of these or both. If I want a particular project name, but I want the assembly and default namespaces, those all three can be different, and I can change them here within the project properties page. The other nice thing about this scheme is that when you create a new class, or various other kinds of objects as well, it's automatically contained in the namespace of the project. That's what this default namespace thing is doing. So if I come over here to Solution Explorer and open up my main customer class, I didn't add this namespace declaration right there. Visual Studio added it for me when I told it I wanted to create the customer class. And then it nested the customer class, the empty body of the customer class definition, within that namespace. So all the time that I've used code and written code and showed you code that reference the customer class, that's actually a shorthand. The real name of the class is ooptechniques.customer. And in fact, if I hover over it like that, you can see that's exactly what it is, ooptechniques.customer. Now, one limitation of this bit of IntelliSense is that if this was a nested namespace, it wouldn't show the parent namespace of OOP Techniques. I think they were probably just trying to save space so that this pop-up box didn't get too wide. All right, so there could be additional namespaces, either nested or separate, and if I needed to use this customer class in some code that isn't in the OOP Techniques namespace, is in this project but not in this namespace, then I would need to reference the full OOP Techniques customer class, unless I used a using statement. I could use using OOP Techniques, and then in the code within that code file, I could use that customer class. So now you can see how some of the features that I've been showing you in Visual C#, how you can implement them in your own classes. Okay, so you'll typically use the name of the project as the namespace in an application, and that's the default in Visual Studio. If you're only using classes defined in that project, you won't have to type the name of the namespace to create an instance of the class, and you don't need to concern yourself with the namespace name at all. However, you may want to create a customer class library that you can use in multiple projects. To do this, you would create a separate project, add the classes that you need, and then compile it into a separate assembly. At that point, you could think about how you want to use namespaces to organize the classes. Now, you probably still want to name your main class customer, so you don't want to use this as the top level or root namespace. Otherwise, you'd have to write code like customer.customer, and then it starts getting really confusing for the person writing the code. What's the namespace, what's the class, and so forth. So something like customer library would be a good name for the project, but not a good name for the namespace, because that would lead to writing code like customer library.customer. which is okay. It's better. So really a good naming solution would be to use your company or team name as the root namespace. And you see this frequently with a lot of add-on technologies that Microsoft creates. The main .NET namespace is all system.something, but you'll often see objects implemented as Microsoft.something because they're following that naming convention. Okay, so this particular project has solution has two different projects. So I have a customer library right there. And that's pretty much what I did. I created this customer, included a tax calculator, a couple of classes in here, and this is a separate project. It's now a library of objects that all wrap customer objects. So now this is a little bit contrived because I have all the other sample code that I've been using for customers, but this is how you would partition it out into a separate project so that it gets compiled into a separate assembly. And if I look at the property pages for this project, you can see that the assembly name is Customer Library and the default namespace is Learn Now Code Library. So I have an assembly. Customer Library is an appropriate name for the project, but now I have the Learn Now Code Library, and that's what I'm going to use in code in order to access these objects. And it also shows how you don't have to use the same default namespace as the assembly name. Now, in order to use Customer Library here within OOP Techniques, I need to add a reference to it. And as you can see, right there, I've already done that. But the way I added that reference is a right-click here, add a reference. That opens up the reference manager. And solution is selected. So if I have more projects in the solution, I can automatically select Customer Library. All right. If it's not part of this solution, I need to go out and browse for it. If it's shared projects, it's various assemblies in the global assembly cache, I can include references in my main OOP Techniques project to this Customer Library. But because it's all part of this solution, it makes it real easy to come in here and select Solution and see that I can select Customer Library. Click on OK, and now I can use that Customer Library within this application. Okay, so I have that external code, and here's some code that now uses it. I have to reference it as that namespace. And the reason I have to do that is because this customer object that I want is not the customer object that's part of OOP Techniques. Take that down. I don't want this customer. I want this customer, and so I need to use the namespace that contains that customer. So again, really nice thing about namespaces is that I can have multiple customer objects that are accessible to my code, but they have to be in different namespaces. Whether they're in the same project and same solution or not, they just have to be in different namespaces. And so you can start to get a feel for how namespaces help you organize your code into essentially functional hierarchies. Okay, then from there on, I'm going to use the information object, customer info, new it up, and then assign properties to it. Let's do the same thing with the nested financial class. So this is using both nested classes as well as namespaces. And then I can new up the tax calculator and then perform various tax calculations. So really the only difference between this code and code that I've been showing you is that I'm using a customer object that's in a separate namespace. And in fact, I can define multiple namespaces in a single project. So if I wanted to define the Learn Now Code Library as part of the OOP Techniques project that contains all my other code, including the program.cs code file that takes care of essentially my user interface, I could do that as well. Just typing this code here doesn't tell me if it's in a separate project, in this project, or anything, just that it's in a separate namespace. Okay, the other thing about this code is that I typed it all out. I don't need to do that. Just like other namespaces, I can use this in a using statement. So I'm going to cut that right there and get rid of that period. And then I can come up here and do a using statement like that, and then go back down to my code. And now I don't need to type out the fully qualified name, except that I still do. The reason is that I now have a customer object that is in this same namespace. And the compiler is going to prefer objects that are in the same namespace, even though I have a using LearnNow code library that also has a customer object. Okay, if I didn't have duplicate customer objects in current namespace, OOP Techniques, as well as the CodeNow library, then I would be able to do this. Okay, and the actual error here is that the type name information doesn't exist in the type customer because the customer object that is part of OOP Techniques doesn't have an information nested class. That was something I added to customer 6. So in order to do this, I would have to change this to customer 6. Okay, so hopefully that's not too confusing. So in this particular case, because I have multiple customer objects, I need to be able to do that. Okay, I'm also going to get rid of this statement because it can cause other confusions, right? But in cases where you're working with namespaces that don't have classes with the same name, then you can use that technique. All right, and you can create as many additional namespaces using the namespace keyword. You'll typically do this to create nested namespaces. For example, you may want to move the code that calculates the sales tax into its own namespace. All right, so if I go back over here, I have tax calculator. And now this tax calculator is still within the LearnNow code library, but it's within a nested namespace called taxes. So if I come back over here to program, when I instantiated that object, I'm using the LearnNow code library .taxes, because that's a nested namespace, and then the tax calculator that's contained within that nested namespace. Now, all of this kind of code that I've been showing you, the using statements and how you reference and instantiate objects and refer to them, their fully qualified names and so forth, this really is nothing new. From this code's perspective, we're doing the exact same thing that we've been doing all along, referencing classes using their namespaces within the .NET framework. But now you know how to implement that same kind of nested namespace hierarchy within your own objects.